Hello, everybody. My name is Benedict Sheehy. I'm a professor in the law school, and I also teach in the graduate research school where I teach applied theories and methods to our PhD students and Masters of Research students. I'm interested in a problem today that we have really not just across the university as we're thinking about what is the nature of the knowledge we're creating, but a problem more broadly in society. So we can think of things like anti-vaxxers, we can think of extreme right-wing movements, we can think of extreme left-wing political ideologies, we can think of fundamentalist religions. And all of these are, in a sense, from one perspective, they're knowledge claims. And when we look at how people get into them or how society struggles to deal with them, it's really extremely important to understand how those knowledge claims are working. When we're conducting our own research, when we're explaining to our students about the nature of the knowledge they're creating, it's incredibly important for us to actually understand what is knowledge, what's the knowledge they're bumping into, what is the nature of their knowledge claim, and whether or not they're sort of stuck in having issues with that. And so what this presentation then does is it examines different types of knowledge claims that we have. And instead of just taking knowledge, usually is when we use the word epistemology, we're talking about philosophy of knowledge. So it's usually a philosophy issue or a philosophical claim. If you think of traditional epistemological definition of knowledge, we talked about it as justified true belief, which is great when we're talking about the epistemology, the philosophical aspects of epistemology. But I think what's extremely important is to think about knowledge claims from a psychological point of view, because that sort of shifts the ground a bit and informs us as researchers in terms of what we're looking at, particularly where we're using social science methods, or we're looking into law, where we're looking at where law meets different social movements or political movements, and in our research, any research outside of pure philosophy, we're interested in epistemology as epistemology. All right. So let's have a look at this. And what I talk about is a belief triangle. And we're going to talk about these as three different sort of modes of epistemology. And we'll see why what we tend to think about as rational knowledge is the exception rather than the rule. This matters for us, for example, in law, where we predicate the whole legal system on people as rational actors. So, for example, we're looking at sentencing somebody who's killed another person through drunk or drink driving. Say, well, that person made some very poor choices. Well, yes and no. The law models that person as somebody who's made a rational choice, go drink excessively, and then made a rational choice to get in a car and go test their driving abilities. No and no. These things happen in social contexts where people aren't thinking well and they're impaired by definition. And that part of that cognitive process, that decision-making, flawed decision-making, only influences sentencing. But the whole model of decision-making, of the beliefs involved, the belief system underlying law, is fundamentally flawed. It's an issue we see in economics, in efforts to modify that through behavioral economics, which catches a little bit of it. So when we start to think about knowledge claims and decision-making, epistemology outside of pure philosophy, we see that there's something else going on here, and this is what I want to talk about today. So for those of you who wanted a pure philosophical discourse on epistemology, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
You can use the clicker if you want.
It's technology beyond me, Martin. Okay, so to me, what this then says is when we try to correct people's beliefs, when we try to correct an anti-vaxxer, you know it's going to fail, right? If I tell a fundamentalist Christian who says, you know, tomorrow morning, the world's going to explode because God told me. Well, you're not going to convince them that they're wrong either, right? So why do these corrections fail? Why do they fail predictably and not occasionally? And there's we can look at an anti-vaxxer 2019 measles, and now under the disastrous leadership of RK Jr., the measles outbreaks again. The people who are anti-vaxxers aren't necessarily stupid. They're not ignorant of science. There are some medical doctors who tipped over into that, and it's odd because that's not the person you necessarily expect to reject science, who may do it in certain instances. And so what's happening here? What we see, oh, well, rational argument will change their view. But we know that's not the case. Why? What's happening? And what that question, because as academics and scholars, we tend to think, oh, they just need more education or better education. It's not true. And we also know that, and we're frustrated. So the question then is, if we're going to answer why and what's happening here, we got to explain why they will accept evidence in one situation, but not in other, and what's happening there. I'm going to try this. You know what? This is the remote.
Oh, okay. Thanks for next time.
All right.
Might take a bit of time for that to operate.
Okay, look, it was fun while it lasted. So what we're going to do then is the limitation you can think of people's belief systems and flexibility, or what they believe to be knowledge, their knowledge claim, is an architectural feature of our cognition of ourselves as humans. And what we see here are what I call cognitive accounts, social identity accounts, and sociological accounts. And a very easy way to think about this is we believe things for three reasons. One, because it makes me feel good, comfort. The other reason we do is because, hey, I'd like to belong to this group, right? Social comfort. Third, because we apply our minds using agreed institutional method for creating truth. The tricky part about this, and why somebody will be a scientist who rejects vaccines, the tricky part about it is because we have biologically a big red light that screams truth. That sounds weird, doesn't it? Think about the last time you were deeply in love with somebody, right? Or thought about being in love with somebody, and the big red light, I'm going to love them forever, which lasted between 18 months and 36. All right. But the red light said true love. Our sense of that feeling, right? My gut feeling, dear God, we had George W. Bush who said, I'm going to go bomb Baghdad because I have a gut feeling it's the right thing to do. Gut feeling. These all tell us it's truth. And then we have an equation we can write on the board, and we can know whether it's true or false, correct? We have that same label of truth for very, very different phenomena. And that's what these are. This is comfort, right? This is how these things make sense to me personally in my own life, my experience, lived experience, right? Interpretive phenomenological analysis. This is the one, this is my tribe. I'm a member of MAGA. I'm a member of One Nation. I'm not just kidding, just an example. I'm a member of the Greens or whatever. This is my group. And whatever they say, I'm in. or a member of the UC Capitol. And then this is, you know what? I have a PhD and I belong and I accept this way of creating knowledge using this method. This counts as true knowledge and this doesn't. So these are, all of these three flash the bright red truth light. They're all different. And so what I want to do then is we're going to go through each of these and understand how they work, why they fail, and when we get stuck. So the point of it, the fundamental point of two of these truth methods is that they're not actually about truth. They're evolutionary adaptations helping us, right? So I love this guy here. If you ever have a chance to read it, Antonio Damasio, very interesting. He talks about this, how our feelings, how we have adapted our sense of right and wrong, of truth, how they're adapted from an evolutionary perspective to our internal states. And I feel hungry, for example, right? Or I survey the land externally, but to our internal states and our physical states, and we take those as truth. That's those are evolutionary adaptations that allowed us to survive. Whether or not there's any factual element to that is a separate issue. But our internal sense of what's happening. So what we have then, it's tuned for fitness, right? That's evolution. It's evolved, reasoning's evolved for argumentation, for social justification. Our sense of somebody, you see a picture, you have an immediate response. That's wrong, right? See a kid, somebody slapping a kid, looks like slapping a kid. That's wrong. And then with these somatic markers that Damasio talks about, all of these are evolutionary adaptations to help us survive. The exception is this rational empirical belief system that we work through universities. Is the primary institution for that. Markets tell us whether somebody will pay for it. Social media tells us whether it's popular. This tells us whether it's true. So these are very different things. So what we have then is this three methods of belief formation. So remember when I talked about philosophy, I talked about knowledge is justified true belief. Here we're looking, and that's something that's going to fit up here. Up here in a sense, although you see that there are elements of it here when we're looking at this question of truth and justification. What we see then here are the rational empirical mode of creating belief or truth. They all flash truth, knowledge. Rational empirical mode, this experiential interpretive mode. So this is when you talk about lived experience, that's this mode. And this is where we belong to our group. When we're doing research, when we're having students research, it's incredibly important to understand which camp they're using. So for example, when we have people positioning, say the first thing you do is position yourself in your research. You know, I'm a Canadian and I'm tall and I speak Dutch and I'm walking. No, you know what I mean? But that's not, that maybe that's very important if I'm doing this type of research. It should be irrelevant doing this type of research. 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of what tribe you're coming from. So this, we have the IPA, right? The lived experience and the sociological. And each one of these is adaptive to a specific context. And I think that's important. So there's a place for each of those. So they're domain appropriate is the way I describe it. None is a degradation of the other. So it's, well, look, I couldn't get a rational empirical answer, which was what I preferred. I couldn't find anything. So I just went to my bedroom and wrote down my thoughts. They're different animals for different purposes. When we look at the rational empirical mode, this is really the exception. It's not an evolutionary adaptive mode. And what it is, it's defined by method rather than institution. That's why you can have IPA at a university. And what's our method here is looking at commensurability, transparency for corroboration, transferability. That's when you have a rational empirical mode created truth. That when that flashes the red light this way, then you have this type of claim. Ben.
Regarding the triangle, can you please refer to the triangle? I was wondering which one is the decisive factor.
None. That's part of our challenge. It depends what this is why when you're theorizing your research, you need to be thinking, what is the nature of the knowledge I want to create? That depends on your research question, which sits in your discipline. Different disciplines. So for example, anthropologists love this stuff, right? Autoethnographic studies. The economists, natural scientists love this stuff. I'm sure there's an equation for it. And these are the qual people, broadly speaking, but they all, those in terms of methods. But the method follows the theory that you're dealing with. And the theory, what theory you're choosing depends on the phenomenon that you want to study from a disciplinary lens. So you start, for example, with this thing here, right? This little clicker. How are we going to study it? Well, we could study it aesthetically. We could say,
Stunning.
huh?
Stunning.
Stunning. That's right. We can study it physically, where I throw it at Craig and it hits him, stunning him. Right? So we can study it through physics. We could drop it. We could study it through the lens. We say we have a marketing question. How many people would pay for this and how much would they pay? Or we could study it autoethnographically. I could say how this particular clicker made me feel like it belonged here. And suddenly, I thought maybe I can ask Marjan if I can take it home tonight. But you see that how you theorize depends on what your research question is. What's your discipline? Are you coming from an anthropological lens? If you come from an anthropological lens, you theorize this as personal meaning. If you take it from a marketing lens, you theorize this as social phenomena, right? Do people like it? Do they not? If you theorize this empirically, maybe through finance, you will do a study of how many dollars, how many people will study, right? So these are different theories of knowledge. These are all true knowledge in a sense, but they're dealing with phenomenon, and how they approach the phenomenon depends on disciplinary understanding. That's why people get all excited. Oh, I'm going to do multidisciplinary work. I say, no. You have to understand where you're starting. Then you can work through the rest. Somewhere down the line, you'll do some multidisciplinary work, and it's very exciting and interesting, but very challenging. This is our big problem. To get to that rational empirical knowledge requires a lot of institutional support. It's not the human default. Right? The human default is, hey, I'm at the party, I'll have another beer before I drive myself home. That's not rational thinking, right? But to have commensurability, transparency, transferability requires institutional support. Hey, here's the right way we do this type of work. This is, if you want to assert a truth claim, here's how it's done. Okay? That's when so when you see undermining of institutions, that's the type of challenge that's being posed. It's easier, and we'll see that, it's easier to challenge these institutions than to support them and make sense of them, because they're contrary to evolutionary adaptive epistemological systems. There's Salvador Carula is here at UC and Health Institute. He's a very interesting guy. He's a psychiatrist who then did PhD in public health. And he's looking at all the differences between everything from clinical trials to lived experience to structured reviews and all the way through. And he's written quite interestingly how these different approaches work in medicine. What we have here then is the experiential interpretive mode, and this is the lived experience. And this goes back to, I was talking earlier, Antonio Damasio's work, which I think is very helpful, where he's talking about response to the internal organs. And he points this out very clearly. We have the difference between feelings and emotions. Emotions being that up and down characteristics of anger, happiness, feelings, things like hunger, thirst, etc. You look at Hans Georg Gadamer's work on the hermeneutical circle, where you never come to a text without context. You come to a text early in the day, right after you've had a good sleep and a coffee, and it's bright, and all of the other things you have read are in your mind when you read that text a certain way. After the dog bit you and your boss shouted at you, you read the text quite differently. Hans Georg Gadamer's work. Varela, this is questions of consciousness, how we are, we're not simply like a hard drive containing data, but it's an expression in interaction with our consciousness, and how Gallagher's talk or views about how context, social context, informs how we think and feel about things. So the idea that knowledge is, in fact, always lived experience in some way or another. And why this resists challenge is because it's experientially grounded. And this is how I felt when I read this. This is what I saw with my own eyes, right? I saw my kid get sick after the vaccine. Nobody's going to tell me differently, you know? If you want to change that, say, look, that's wrong. You're going to unravel that person's whole history, right? Their whole experience of life. So it's very hard to change that, right? So the feeling rings true. The belief rings true. The feeling is really purely phenomenological. It goes along with the story that we tell about ourselves. There's a very interesting book. It was written in 1903 and 1912 by William James, called Varieties of Religious Experience. And he writes about that, as does Evelyn Underhill, who was writing in the same period. They were talking about when people have a mystical religious experience and they see God. And the interesting thing is everybody around the world has that experience. The Catholic sees Mary, the Buddhist sees a bodhisattva, the Shinto person, has their experience again, of the Buddha. The Taoist watches the river come out. So that story in which they interpret that, right? It seems absolutely true. Again, we have that pre-existing red truth light ready to flare, and that's shaped. It's experienced individually, shaped by our social context, but it's, it becomes so much part of us, we don't see that. The sociological mode is interesting because this is what I said. Remember, comfort, belonging, truth. The belonging part is this question of belonging to a certain group. So if somebody tells you, the university, you see every bit of knowledge they've said is in fact a conspiracy. Every one of your publications is a conspiracy. That's not going to go well. Some of us are grads of UC. Somebody like Festinger talks about it, cognitive dissonance. Like that's impossible. It just doesn't make any sense to us. That's that sociological mode of belonging to that community. There's another bit, and this is what we see people with virtue signaling and vice signaling. So virtue signaling, we're better than everybody else. We're the most enlightened group on the planet. And so they distinguish themselves in a social group by their attachment to one group or another. By signaling, this is, let's be the most unpleasant people we can be, aka Trump, Vance, etc. What's interesting is this doesn't persuade people to believe. You don't listen to Trump and go, gee, I was wrong. I guess they're right in winning the war in Iran after all, the invasion of Iran. And what it is, it's a different thing. It sets you up by belonging to a group to sort of check out certain critical faculties and go along with that story. So put it this way, if you belong with the group and the group says we're going this way, you're going to go along, right? It sets the direction of travel for your thoughts. What's true? What turns on your truth light? What we have then is we've got the different contexts in which these different truth lights are correct. This goes to your question, Ben. Here in professional technical, we've got rational empirical, right? In that context, that's the right thing. In an intimate spiritual sense, if somebody comes and says to you, you know what, my mother died this morning, and you say, oh, well, that's interesting because last night over 1 million people died. Of that, 1/4 of them were mothers. So your mom's part of that group, right? Wrong. That's applying this type of knowledge to this type of context, right? And it's the same here, where that, I want to belong to MAGA. Why? Because they're in power right now. So there are different contexts doing that validate this is the right way to say what's true in these different contexts. Mindful, I gotta shut up on time. Fucking my favorite academic thing. 50 slides for a 20-minute presentation. All right. So this runs a bit against who we are and how we think, because we tend to think that being rational in every context is in fact correct. But it's actually understanding which context, which type of knowledge applies. So flexibility across contexts. And this is where our research gets a little hairy, gets a little difficult sometimes, because we're in a context that can allow all three types in. And to sort them out, which in the context of our research, which type of epistemology we need to answer our research question can be challenging. So for example, when you're doing a focus group is going to have two things operating. It's going to have an IPA, right? The lived experience, and it's going to have the little group itself, possibly, right? If you've got a little group of students who all studied economics at UC or whatever, you're going to have that, but you may be trying to do a whole group of those, so you'll try to layer over top of that a rational empirical study, but you use that for data creation and collection, right? So understanding what's the context, what are you looking at? So being flexible is the important thing in our situation. It doesn't mean that there's no truth, that there's no underlying truth. There certainly is. And then we talk about this contextual pragmatism, where there is a fact. The fact of the matter is, we can talk about that then in certain empirical and logical domains. In other situations, there is no fact of the matter, how I feel, or what's important to me, meaning, values. There isn't a fact of the matter. This is what political fights are about, right? Those questions of identity, that's IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis, or questions of belonging by group. It doesn't apply. So contextual pragmatism allows those two to coexist. But it's a matter of realizing where each one is in fact a pragmatic answer. So for example, if I say, you know what, I believe I'm the center of the universe, and all of you guys need to smarten up and get on with the program. Well, this may work for me at my individual level. Nobody else has to agree. Okay, I can do a survey of you, and I don't think anybody's going to share that view. So what happens then when we end up in trouble is we end up with a misapplication or what I call partial calcification. So this is deploying, the misapplication is deploying the wrong mode in that context. So the three modes of creating: comfort, belonging, and rational empirical. If we use one of those, say, for example, I gave the example of emotional, and I put it in the context of, it was an emotional context of somebody's mother dying, and using the irrational empirical mode. There you've got a misapplication, okay? Or you can say, here's that thing, oh, well, do you think we should go, should we give up on the vaccines? And you say, well, everybody else has. Well, that's the social argument, right? That's the belonging argument. It doesn't mean it's truth. Well, if somebody says, should I buy brown shoes? And somebody says, everybody else has. Well, then it's the right thing to do, to belong to the brown shoe group, right? So understanding what the question is, what the context is, avoids misapplication. You end up with trouble, pathology, if you want to call it, when there's a misapplication. The other is when there's a partial calcification, if you like to call that, when these things start to coalesce. So your identity, for example, if I identify as a Canadian, and then I get into a group, and everybody says, we're all Canadian, this is what we all think. I've got two of those methods going together, right? Or you can see this, people say, you know what, this is my lived experience. I'm a university researcher, I do lived experience. Therefore, everybody who belongs in lived experience, we're the ones that do it right. Okay? So understanding that is important. It's important because if you want to try, this goes back to the basic question, how do you get an anti-vaxxer to stop being an anti-vaxxer? How does that type of work happen? And what it does, it requires you to sort of disaggregate these different types of knowledge, these different epistemologies at work, and figure out what's happening in each one. How people are getting stuck. Whoops. It actually allows you to create testable questions or hypotheses. It wasn't my size sometimes. When you're going to have, so I talked about partial calcifications, when two of those line up, right? When you have all three line up, this is when you've got the crazy ideologues, the people that just can't, or are really badly stuck. You think here, for example, there's a fun example of an astrologist. People who believe deeply in astrology and go to an astrological financial consultant. Anybody who want to do that, I provide that service for $2,500 cash. All right, and so what you have then is people, this are the flat earthers. You've heard of the flat earthers, right? This is what's happened to them, is they've got this plausibility structure. Oh, do your own research. Anti-vaxxers, do your own research. They don't mean setting up a research lab. They mean get on the internet and talk to the other kooks. Or, the status you can get. This question of status, this goes to the social bit. Because this is really what this is. This is the pseudo scientific type stuff. It's not that anti-vaxxers are dead wrong on every point. There are issues with vaccines, but that's a separate issue when it becomes a political agenda. Status economy, that's different, where that's our exclusionary. I belong to so-and-so or whatever. I belong to this, that's status economy. And misattribution that we talked about, using the wrong lens. When those combine, you get people who are really stuck. You can actually run this into a series of experiments and a research agenda in psychology if that was of interest to you. And what you'd be looking is how variable people are across different contexts. Do people take lived experience to answer all of their questions? Or do people, this question, this fabulous Disney Hollywood thing, follow your heart and you'll never go wrong until you're unemployed, broke, and living in the gutter. Some of us at least. Or how variable, because really what I suspect you do is you find greater variation within individuals than across individuals or something like that. You could also look at when do those structural conditions, so for example, the transferability, falsifiability, and transparency, when do those fall apart? When do they work? And at what stage? Intervention effectiveness. So if you look at where people are in terms of how, if it's like just a misapplication, if you create reframing, does it help them? So for example, we go back, I don't know what it is about somebody's mother died yesterday, but if you went and talked to them and said, look, I'm sorry you're feeling that way, training a counselor, if you train counselors, look, here's how you respond to this, here's how you respond to that. Can that make you more effective? You can go look at Rogerian counseling for something like that. And this would be very interesting when looking at a developmental trajectory where you're looking at something that comes into a cult or a political movement. And if you caught it quite early and follow it along and see how those things work, whether or not you'd be able to be in intervention. And I think this, to me, is kind of the real takeaway from it, that rational belief is the exception. Remember, from an evolutionary perspective, being comfortable, being well-fed, being safe, that's priority one. That's the first red truth light, right? That's evolutionary adaptation. The second evolutionary adaptation is I look around at my people, the community I belong to, and what they tell me is true, I'm going along with them. Evolutionary adaptation. This is not. The effort to create knowledge, rational empirical means, is something that requires extensive institutional support in order for that to go. And that's, that's a question. I think that's a challenge for us at universities globally. That's a challenge at our university as there's more and more pressure to generate money and teach and forget really what the university is about, which is in the first instance or primarily knowledge creation, trying to follow some type of rationale or rationality rather than IPA or social following the bird. Anyways, that's it.
Questions? Who would like to ask the very first question?
Someone has like, we just finished bargaining anyway.
Oh,
Yeah, but anyway, so with the social thing, I've always interested in your thoughts on this. So, just say I'm a Republican, identify as being a US Republican. What that means changed a lot. So, I used to be passionately free trade. Now I'm passionately protectionist. I used to be faithful to my allies. Now I hate my allies. I used to be vaccination. I was anti-vaccination. So, but I'm still a Republican. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's actually the challenge, Craig. Because so how do we explain that? Those questions of things like free trade and vaccination are rational empirical questions. The reason that they've not engaged with that, why they're not interested in that, is because they're interested in their social identity as Republican, because my father was, my grandfather was, my great-grandfather was, and that supersedes these other forms of knowledge. So the question that we're looking at here is, how would you engage someone like that? It's not a question of fact. It's a question of how that social group is working. And this is when you see that the split within the Republicans that's emerging, you know, as people are starting to question, what does it mean? This question, what does it mean to belong to the group? You know, the radical right wing there, the rhinos, Republican, you know, talking about everyone else, Tea Party, everyone else Republican in name only. We're the true Republicans. But they're still Republicans. Yeah.
Ben, do you have a question?
Yeah, just quick comment, like, say regarding vaccine, right? Vaccination, say, I can see, right, during the COVID-19, right, in Queensland, for example, like some people, they like stood along the street and then they raised some like images like, showing like, oh, we not ready to be vaccinated because of ABCD. So I'm wondering, like, maybe because of the side effects of vaccine, so but the net benefit of the vaccine is positive, right? So that is why majority of people were vaccinated.
Yeah, and those are, I mean, they're like that, that example in the pandemic is a challenging example because it's new illness, you know, a new virus. There are questions about the efficacy of the vaccine, the safety of the vaccine, as well as right-wing anti-establishment, right? Anti-institutionalism at work. They're seeing here's an opportunity to undermine institutions of government, undermine government authority. So they're not interested whether vaccines work or they don't. And in fact, some of them will take vaccines and go to an anti-vaccine protest because they see their opportunity to attack government. So there's political issues around that, as well as legal philosophy where people are, you know, radically committed. Their social community is, we're libertarian. No one's ever going to tell me anything to do. And I will walk on public streets and I will share a language with everyone else and I will have an education. But I'll just pretend none of that happened. So it's quite complex phenomenon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just wondering about grounded theory, for example. So as far as I'm understanding how it works, is that you should forget about the assumptions of already existing theories and you should start everything from the scratch. So do you think we can categorize methodologies as a way to find out which one allows agency to think in our own ways, which one includes lived experiences of a particular group, so we can have a more accurate and more purposeful research?
Well, Marjane, you've got four very distinct concepts there. Question of method, you know, Glasser's grounded theory, you know, which is really more of a method with an implication for creation of theory. Then you have questions of agency. Then you have questions of, you know, more pertinent research, you know, better hitting research or more impactful research. Those are, to me, very, very distinct things. And I'll sort of rephrase them and reframe it and pick it in this way. And what I'll say is, what's the role of Glasser's grounded theory, right? Where does grounded theory fit in there? So, and in an odd way, it's related to Ben's questions about vaccination. That idea is that there is something underlying, there's social phenomena and ideas about social phenomena that are not appropriately or adequately caught by existing theories. And the way to access those is by not starting with a theoretical lens, but to start with people, their comments, their ideas. And I think there's certainly an obviously value in that. This is, you know, what I was saying earlier, it's people, they'll come with their lived experience and or their social group and talk to you about those things. Then as the researcher, it's up to you to say, yes, this is a little coherent chunk by itself that's independent of existing understandings, or it's not. Where it's not, then you've created something different. But you know, maybe most of that stuff may be different in the smaller level, but fits with a higher up theory.
Well, let's just see if we have anybody who's asking questions online. Apparently not. Well, is there any other question that you would like to ask? Any last one? Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. This was quite informative and helpful. Really opens our eyes into thinking about doing research in a completely different way. I mean, the roots of it and how to start, I think, and how, I mean, to me, also that connection to the methods, it makes sense why we are choosing a particular perspective or how we start a research, I think. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for coming.